Welcome to the Bookworm Duo, where we explore a variety of books. Today we explore a nonfiction bestseller. Let's get started.
Yeah, it's really interesting how white rural rage, the threat to American democracy, kind of takes us on a journey through the history of rural America's political landscape,
Okay.
starting from like the late 1960s and early 1970s.
Okay, so walk me through this. What was happening back then that set the stage for the book's main arguments?
Well, this period was marked by like significant social and political upheaval.
Yeah,
You had the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and the rise of the counterculture,
right.
all of which challenged traditional values and institutions.
And how did rural America react to these changes?
The book argues that many rural communities felt left behind and alienated by these cultural shifts.
Mm-hmm.
They saw their way of life being threatened,
Right.
and they began to develop a sense of resentment towards the urban elites who they felt were driving these changes.
So it sounds like the seeds of rural rage were sown during this period of rapid social change. What happened next?
So fast forward to the 1980s,
Okay,
and you see this resentment start to manifest itself politically.
okay.
Ronald Reagan's presidency, with its emphasis on traditional values and a strong military, appealed to many rural voters who felt that he understood their concerns.
But Reagan was also Republican, and the Republican Party has traditionally been seen as the party of big business and the wealthy. How did he bridge that gap with rural voters who are often struggling economically?
That's a great question. The book argues that Reagan was able to connect with rural voters by tapping into their cultural anxieties. He framed issues like abortion, gun control, and school prayer as attacks on their values and way of life.
Okay,
And he positioned himself as a defender of those values.
so it's not just about economics, it's about identity and a sense of belonging. How did this dynamic continue to play out after Reagan left office?
The book argues that this trend continued through the 1990s and into the 2000s. The rise of conservative media outlets like Fox News helped to reinforce this narrative of rural victimhood. And politicians like Newt Gingrich and George W. Bush continued to appeal to rural voters by tapping into their cultural anxieties.
So there's this growing sense of alienation and resentment building up over decades. And then comes Donald Trump. How did he fit into this narrative?
Well, the book argues that Trump was able to capitalize on this pre-existing anger and resentment in a way that no other politician had been able to do before.
Yeah.
He was a master of tapping into the fears and frustrations of rural voters, and he offered them a scapegoat for their problems: immigrants, minorities, and liberal elites.
And it wasn't just his rhetoric, he also enacted policies that appealed to his rural base, right?
Absolutely. He withdrew the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, which was seen as a threat to American jobs.
Right.
And he imposed tariffs on goods from China, which appealed to voters in manufacturing areas that had been hit hard by globalization.
So he was speaking their language and taking actions that seemed to align with their interest. But the book also argues that Trump's rise was a symptom of a deeper problem in American democracy, right?
Exactly. The book contends that Trump's success exposed the growing divide between urban and rural America,
Right.
a divide that is not just economic but also cultural and political. This divide, which the authors call the density divide, is fueled by a number of factors, including the decline of manufacturing jobs, the rise of the service sector, and the increasing concentration of wealth and opportunity in urban areas.
So it's not just about Trump, it's about a system that has left many rural communities behind and created a fertile ground for resentment and anger. But this divide is not just about economics, is it? The book also talks about the role of the culture war in widening the gap between urban and rural America.
Yes, the book argues that the culture war has become a central dividing line in American politics, and this divide is particularly stuck between urban and rural areas. Issues like abortion, gun control, LGBTQ+ rights, and the role of religion in public life have become battlegrounds in a larger struggle over values and identity.
And these battles are often fought in very personal terms, aren't they?
Absolutely.
It's not just about abstract political ideas, it's about people's deeply held beliefs about right and wrong, good and evil.
Absolutely. The book provides numerous examples of how the culture war is playing out in rural communities, from book banning campaigns in schools and libraries to the rise of Christian nationalism as a political force.
So you have this combustible mix of economic anxiety, cultural resentment, and a political system that seems unresponsive to the needs of many rural communities. And then you add in the rise of social media and the spread of misinformation, and it's no wonder that we're seeing such a rise in political polarization and extremism.
The book argues that social media has played a key role in amplifying these divisions. creating echo chambers where people are exposed only to information that confirms their existing biases. This has led to a decline in civil discourse and a rise in political violence.
So the book paints a pretty bleak picture of the state of American democracy, but it also offers some suggestions for how to address these challenges, right?
Yes, the book argues that addressing the challenges facing rural America and mitigating the threat to democracy requires acknowledging the diverse experiences of its residents and working to bridge the urban-rural divide.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? What are some concrete steps that can be taken?
Well, the book suggests that this will involve tackling economic inequality, improving access to healthcare and education, and promoting civic engagement across all communities.
Those are all big systemic issues. How do we even begin to address them?
The book argues that it starts with listening to and understanding the concerns of rural Americans. It calls for a renewed focus on investing in rural communities, creating jobs, and improving the quality of life for people who live outside of major metropolitan areas.
It sounds like it's going to take a lot more than just throwing money at the problem. It's going to require a fundamental shift in how we think about the relationship between urban and rural America.
Absolutely. The book argues that we need to move beyond the stereotypes and caricatures that often define our understanding of rural America.
Right.
We need to recognize the diversity of experiences within rural communities and the shared challenges that we face as a nation.
So the book is a call to action.
Yeah,
It's a warning about the dangers of ignoring the anger and resentment that is brewing in rural America. But it's also a plea for understanding, empathy, and a renewed commitment to finding common ground.
exactly. It's a reminder that we are all Americans, regardless of where we live or our political beliefs, and that we need to work together to address the challenges facing our country.
This is all pretty heavy stuff, but I'm curious to dive deeper into some of the specific examples that the book uses to illustrate its arguments. You mentioned the culture war earlier. Can you give me an example of how that's playing out in rural communities?
Sure, the book talks about the controversy over the teaching of critical race theory in schools.
Okay.
This theory, which examines the role of racism in American history and institutions, has become a flashpoint for conservative activists who see it as an attempt to indoctrinate children with a liberal agenda.
And this is playing out in school board meetings and local elections across the country, right?
Exactly. You're seeing parents protesting against the teaching of critical race theory, and you're seeing candidates running for school board on platforms that promise to ban it from the curriculum.
So it's not just an academic debate. It's becoming a very real political issue that's mobilizing voters, particularly in rural areas where traditional values and patriotism are often seen as under attack.
That's right. The book argues that these cultural battles are often a proxy for deeper anxieties about social and economic change. Rural communities feel like they're losing their way of life, and they're lashing out at anything that they perceive as a threat to their values.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. But I'm glad that the book is shining a light on it and trying to start a conversation about how to address it. Now, you mentioned the density divide earlier. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Sure. The density divide refers to the growing gap between urban and rural areas, not just in terms of economics, but also in terms of culture, values, and political beliefs. The book argues that this divide is fueled by a number of factors.
Like what?
Well, one factor is the decline of manufacturing jobs, which has hit rural areas particularly hard. As the factories have closed and jobs have moved overseas, many rural communities have seen their economic base erode, leading to poverty, unemployment, and a sense of hopelessness.
And this economic decline has also led to a brain drain, right? Young people are leaving rural areas in search of better opportunities, leaving behind an aging population that's struggling to keep up with the changing times.
Exactly. This exodus of young people has further exacerbated the economic and social problems facing rural communities. It's created a vicious cycle where decline breeds further decline.
So you have this economic divide, but the book also argues that there's a cultural divide as well, right?
Yes, the book talks about the different values and lifestyles that often characterize urban and rural areas. Urban areas tend to be more diverse, more cosmopolitan, and more accepting of different lifestyles.
Right.
Rural areas, on the other hand, tend to be more homogeneous, more traditional, and more suspicious of outsiders.
And these cultural differences can sometimes lead to misunderstandings and even hostility, right?
Absolutely. The book provides numerous examples of how cultural clashes have played out in American politics, from the debates over same-sex marriage to the controversy over the removal of Confederate statues.
It sounds like the density divide is a complex issue with deep roots in American history and culture. It's not something that's going to be solved overnight.
No, it's not. But the book argues that it's an issue that we need to address if we want to heal the divisions in our country and preserve our democracy. We need to find ways to bridge the gap between urban and rural America, to build understanding and empathy, and to find common ground on the issues that divide us.
It's a tall order, but I think it's an important one. Thanks for helping me to understand the book's argument so far. I'm eager to hear more about the specific examples and anecdotes that the authors use to bring these ideas to life. Where do we go from here?
Well, the book doesn't just focus on broad trends and abstract ideas. It also delves into specific historical events that have shaped a relationship between rural America and the political system.
Okay.
It explores how these events have contributed to the rise of rural rage and the threat to American democracy.
Let's get into those then. What are some of the key events that their book highlights?
One of the key events that the book discusses is the backlash against the civil rights movement in the 1960s. The book argues that many white rural Americans felt threatened by the gains made by African Americans during this period, and they saw the civil rights movement as an attack on their way of life.
And this backlash wasn't just limited to the South, right?
No, it was a national phenomenon. The book provides examples of white resistance to school immigration and affirmative action programs in both the North and the South. It argues that this backlash helped to fuel the rise of the conservative movement and laid the groundwork for the political polarization that we see today.
So the civil rights movement was a turning point in American history,
Yeah,
but it also created a deep rift between black and white Americans and between urban and rural communities.
that's right. The book argues that this rift has never fully healed and it continues to shape our politics and our culture today. Another key event that the book discusses is the Vietnam War. The book argues that the war had a profound impact on rural America, both in terms of the number of young men who were killed or wounded, and in terms of the social and political divisions that it created.
The war was incredibly divisive, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. The book talks about how the war divided families and communities, and how it fueled anti-government sentiment and distrust of authority.
And this distrust of authority is something that we see continuing to this day, isn't it?
Absolutely. The book argues that the Vietnam War helped to create a climate of suspicion and resentment that has made it difficult for the government to address the challenges facing rural America.
So the war had a lasting impact on the relationship between rural America and the government, and it helped to create the conditions for the rise of rural rage.
Exactly. The book then moves on to discuss the economic transformations of the 1970s and 1980s, which had a devastating impact on many rural communities. The decline of manufacturing, the rise of globalization, and the shift to a service-based economy led to job losses, factory closures, and a sense of economic insecurity in many rural areas.
And this economic insecurity fueled the resentment and anger that we're talking about, right?
Yes, it did. The book argues that the economic struggles of rural America have been largely ignored by policymakers, and that this neglect has contributed to the sense of alienation and anger that many rural Americans feel.
So the book is tracing a historical narrative here, showing how a series of events and trends have led to the current state of affairs. It's not just about Trump, it's about a much longer and deeper story.
That's right. The book is trying to provide a context for understanding the rise of rural rage and the threat to American democracy. It's arguing that these phenomena are the result of long-standing economic, social, and political forces that have been at work for decades.
It's a fascinating and sobering analysis. I'm eager to hear more about how the book connects these historical events to the present day. What are some of the specific examples that the book uses to illustrate its arguments?
Well, the book doesn't just focus on broad historical trends. It also delves into specific case studies that highlight the challenges facing rural communities and the ways in which those challenges are contributing to the rise of rural rage. One of the case studies that the book examines is the opioid epidemic, which has had a devastating impact on rural America.
The opioid epidemic has been a national crisis, but it's hit rural areas particularly hard, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. The book talks about how the opioid epidemic is a symptom of the despair and hopelessness that many rural Americans feel. It argues that the epidemic is fueled by a combination of factors, including economic decline, social isolation, and the lack of access to health care.
And this despair and hopelessness is something that we've been talking about throughout this conversation, isn't it? It's the underlying current that's driving so much of the anger and resentment that we're seeing.
That's right. The book argues that the opioid epidemic is a manifestation of the deeper problems facing rural America, and that it's a sign of the urgent need for change.
So the book is not just about politics, it's also about the human cost of these trends. It's about the real people who are struggling with addiction, poverty, and despair.
Exactly. The book is trying to humanize the issue of rural rage and to show how it's connected to the lived experiences of people in rural communities. Another case study that the book examines is the rise of the militia movement, which is a sign of the growing distrust of government and the increasing willingness to resort to violence among some segments of the population.
The militia movement is a fringe group, but it's a dangerous one, isn't it?
Yes, it is. The book talks about how the militia movement is fueled by conspiracy theories, anti-government sentiment, and a belief in the right to use violence to defend one's rights. It argues that the movement is a symptom of the deep divisions in American society and the erosion of trust in democratic institutions.
So the book is warning us about the dangers of extremism and the potential for violence, particularly in rural areas where distrust of government is high and gun ownership is widespread.
That's right. The book is arguing that we need to take these threats seriously and to address the underlying conditions that are fueling them.
It's a sobering reminder that the stakes are high. We're not just talking about abstract political debates here. We're talking about the future of our democracy and the safety of our communities.
Exactly. The book is a call to action, urging us to engage in the difficult conversations that we need to have in order to address the challenges facing our country.
It's a lot to take in, but I appreciate you taking the time to walk me through it. It's clear that this book is a valuable contribution to the national conversation about rural America and the future of our democracy.
I agree. I think it's an important book for anyone who wants to understand the forces that are shaping our country today.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. I'm sure our listeners are finding this as insightful as I am.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy exploring these complex issues and trying to make sense of the world around us.
And I think it's important to remember that these are not just abstract ideas. They have real-world consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely. The book is a reminder that the choices we make as a society have a profound impact on the well-being of our communities and the health of our democracy.
Well said. I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation in our next episode, where we'll dive deeper into some of the book's more specific arguments and explore some potential solutions to the challenges that it raises.
Sounds good to me. I'm always eager to delve further into these topics and to consider different perspectives.
Great. Until then, thanks for listening, folks.
So picking up where we left off, the book kind of dives into the heart of the 2008 election and the rise of the Tea Party movement.
Right.
This period really illustrates how economic anxieties coupled with like a changing cultural landscape began to solidify this sense of rural rage.
You know, for many, the 2008 financial crisis felt like the rug was pulled out from under them. How did this play into the narrative of rural America feeling ignored and left behind?
It was a perfect storm. The book portrays the Tea Party movement born out of this financial crisis as a visceral reaction to the perceived excesses of the government and a sense that the system wasn't working for them anymore.
The Tea Party was certainly vocal, but was it really a turning point in how rural resentment manifested in politics?
The authors argue that it was a pivotal moment. The Tea Party channeled this existing rural rage, pushing back against the establishment and demanding a return to a perceived, simpler America. This resonated deeply with many rural voters who felt economically and culturally marginalized.
It's interesting how the book frames this period as a shift from anxieties to action, with rural voters becoming more assertive in their political demands. But wasn't the Tea Party also criticized for its sometimes extreme rhetoric?
Absolutely. The book doesn't shy away from the Tea Party's flaws. It acknowledges that the movement was often driven by anger and resentment.
Right.
And that its rhetoric sometimes veered into conspiracy theories and xenophobia.
It sounds like the authors are trying to present a balanced view, acknowledging the legitimate grievances of rural America, while also recognizing how those grievances can be manipulated and exploited. How does the book connect the Tea Party to the eventual rise of Donald Trump?
The book suggests that the Tea Party paved the way for Trump by further deepening the political and cultural divide. It normalized a certain level of anger and distrust in politics,
Right.
creating a fertile ground for Trump's populist message to take root.
It's fascinating how the authors weave together this chain of events, showing how each one builds on the last. So we have this simmering discontent fueled by decades of economic and cultural shifts. Then the financial crisis explodes, and the Tea Party emerges as a powerful voice for rural resentment. And this, the book argues, sets the stage for Trump.
Exactly. And what's important here is that Trump didn't create this anger. I tapped into it.
Right.
He understood the deep sense of grievance felt by many rural voters, and he expertly channeled that anger into political support.
The book dives into the 2016 election, examining how Trump's campaign resonated with rural voters. What were some of the key aspects of his messaging that really struck a chord?
Trump's promise to make America great again played directly into this nostalgia for a perceived better past. He framed himself as the champion of the forgotten man, someone who would fight for those who felt ignored by the political establishment.
And it wasn't just what he said, but how he said it, right?
Absolutely, Trump's blunt anti-establishment style resonated with voters who felt the politicians were out of touch
Yeah.
and didn't understand their struggles. He was seen as authentic, someone who spoke their language and wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo.
The book argues that this perception of authenticity, combined with his promises to bring back jobs and restore America's greatness, helped him win over many rural voters who felt abandoned by both parties. But beyond the economic anxieties, how did Trump tap into the cultural fears that the book has been highlighting?
Trump skillfully played on the anxieties surrounding cultural change. His rhetoric on immigration, Islam, and political correctness resonated with voters who felt that their values and way of life were under attack.
The book mentions this idea of cultural displacement. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, the book suggests that many rural voters feel like strangers in their own country,
Mm-hmm.
that the America they knew is slipping away. This feeling of cultural displacement, coupled with economic anxieties, creates a potent mix of anger and resentment.
It's this feeling that they grew up in the America of their values and traditions is being replaced by something foreign and threatening. And Trump tapped into that fear brilliantly.
Exactly. He became a symbol of resistance against these changes, a voice for those who felt voiceless.
The book also examines the role of the media in amplifying this sense of grievance. How did media coverage, especially from conservative outlets, contribute to the rise of rural rage?
The book argues that certain media outlets played a crucial role in shaping the narrative of rural victimhood. They constantly reinforced the message that rural America was under attack by liberal elites, immigrants, and a changing culture.
It's almost like an echo chamber, where these anxieties and resentments are constantly validated and amplified. Did the book give any specific examples of how this played out?
The book cites coverage of issues like gun control, same-sex marriage, and environmental regulations as examples of how these outlets frame the debate in a way that fueled outrage and resentment among rural viewers.
So it's not just about reporting the news, it's about shaping a narrative that resonates with a specific audience. And in this case, that narrative was one of rural America being besieged by forces that threaten their way of life.
Exactly. And this constant reinforcement of a victimhood narrative helped solidify a sense of, us versus them, further dividing rural and urban America.
The book dives into the specific policies and actions of the Trump administration, analyzing how they catered to this rural base. What were some of the key policy areas that really stood out?
One prominent example was Trump's focus on deregulation, particularly in industries like agriculture and energy that have a significant presence in rural areas. This was seen as a victory for rural communities who felt overregulated by the federal government.
So it was about rolling back what they saw as government intrusion into their lives and livelihoods. What about trade? Trump made trade a central part of his campaign, promising to bring back manufacturing jobs. How did this resonate with rural voters?
Trump's trade policies, particularly the tariffs imposed on goods from China, were popular with many rural voters who saw them as a way to protect American jobs and stand up to China's economic dominance.
But weren't there also concerns that these tariffs would hurt farmers and other businesses that relied on trade?
Yes, the book acknowledges that the tariffs had mixed effects. While some industries benefited, others were hurt, and the overall impact on rural economies is still being debated.
So it's a complex issue with winners and losers, but it seems like the symbolic value of these policies, the perception that Trump was fighting for them, may have outweighed any economic concerns for many rural voters?
That's a key point that the book emphasizes. The symbolism of Trump's actions, his willingness to challenge the status quo and fight for what he saw as American interest, resonated deeply with many rural voters, even if the actual economic benefits were less clear-cut.
The book doesn't just analyze Trump's policies, it also examines his rhetoric and how he used language to connect with this sense of rural rage. Can you give an example of this?
One example is Trump's repeated attacks on political correctness. He framed this as a form of elitism that stifled free speech and dismissed the concerns of ordinary Americans. This resonated with many rural voters who felt that their values and beliefs were being marginalized by urban elites.
It was like he was giving them permission to say what they were really thinking, to express their frustrations, without fear of being labeled as bigoted or intolerant.
Exactly. He created a space where their anger and resentment felt validated and where they felt like they finally had someone who understood them.
And the book goes beyond Trump examining the broader phenomenon of right-wing populism and how it has taken root in rural America. What are some of the key characteristics of this movement that the book identifies?
The book describes right-wing populism as a movement that is fueled by a sense of grievance, a distrust of elites, and a belief that the system is rigged against ordinary people.
Okay.
It often appeals to a sense of national identity and traditional values, framing them as being under attack by outside forces.
And this rhetoric of being under attack, of being victims of a corrupt system, is something we've seen throughout the book, right?
Absolutely. It's a recurring theme, and it's a powerful motivator. It creates a sense of urgency and justifies extreme measures. It's the siege mentality that the book argues makes right-wing populism so dangerous.
The book doesn't just analyze the past. It also looks ahead, speculating on the future of rural rage and its potential impact on American democracy. What are some of the key concerns that the book raises about the future?
One of the book's biggest concerns is the erosion of democratic norms. It argues that the increasing acceptance of violence and the willingness to undermine democratic institutions to achieve political goals pose a serious threat to the stability of American democracy.
And this erosion of norms is particularly evident in rural areas, right?
The book suggests that the distrust of institutions and the belief that the system is rigged is particularly acute in rural communities, making them more susceptible to anti-democratic movements and ideologies.
So it's not just about political disagreements, it's about a fundamental breakdown in the shared values and principles that underpin a functioning democracy. That's a pretty chilling thought.
It is. The book doesn't offer easy answers, but it stresses the importance of understanding the root causes of rural rage and finding ways to address the underlying economic and cultural anxieties that are fueling it.
It sounds like a monumental task, but one that's crucial for the future of American democracy.
Absolutely. And it's a conversation that we need to have even if it's uncomfortable. Ignoring these issues won't make them go away.
This has been a truly fascinating dive into a complex and challenging topic. Thanks for sharing your expertise and helping us unpack these intricate ideas.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy exploring these topics and trying to make sense of the world around us.
Before we wrap up part 2, I'm curious to get your take on something. The book paints a fairly bleak picture of the state of rural America and its relationship with the political system. Do you see any signs of hope? Any potential paths forward?
That's a great question, and one that I think a lot of people are grappling with. While the book highlights the challenges, it also emphasizes that rural America is not a monolith. There's diversity of opinion and experience within these communities.
So it's not about writing off an entire segment of the population, but rather about understanding the nuances and complexities of their experiences.
Exactly. And within that complexity, there are glimmers of hope. There are individuals and organizations working to bridge divides, to address economic disparities, and to promote civic engagement in rural communities.
It's about finding common ground, building bridges, and recognizing that we're all in this together regardless of where we live or our political beliefs.
That's the key takeaway. It's not going to be easy, but the book ultimately offers a message of hope, suggesting that through dialogue and understanding, and a commitment to addressing the root causes of rural rage, we can build a more just and equitable society for all Americans.
That's a message worth holding on to. Thanks again for this insightful conversation. I'm looking forward to continuing this exploration in our next episode, where we'll delve into some potential solutions and discuss what we can all do to contribute to a more united and democratic future.
As we've been talking about white rural rage, it's become clear that this isn't just a political analysis. It's a story about people, real people grappling with real challenges.
Right.
And that's, I think, what makes this book so powerful.
I completely agree. It's easy to get caught up in the abstract ideas and political debates, but ultimately, this is about the lives and experiences of individuals and communities.
And one of the things that the book does so well is challenge the monolithic view of rural America. It reminds us that these communities are diverse with a wide range of perspectives and experiences.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the anger and resentment felt by many rural voters, but the book also highlights the resilience and the strong sense of community that exists in these areas.
Absolutely. It explores the deep connection to place and tradition that many rural residents feel. It talks about the importance of family faith and hard work. These values are often at the heart of what defines rural identity.
And it's important to remember that these values aren't exclusive to rural America. They're shared by many Americans regardless of where they live.
Exactly. The book isn't trying to create a divide between urban and rural America.
Right.
It's trying to bridge that divide by fostering understanding and empathy.
It's about recognizing our shared humanity and finding ways to work together to address the challenges we face as a nation.
One of the key themes that emerges in the latter part of the book is the need for economic justice. It argues that the economic disparities between urban and rural areas are a major driver of the anger and resentment we've been discussing.
The book goes into some detail about the specific economic challenges faced by rural communities. What were some of the key takeaways there?
The book highlights the decline of manufacturing jobs, the consolidation of agriculture, and the lack of investment in infrastructure and education as major factors contributing to rural economic decline.
And these economic struggles have real-world consequences for people's lives. They lead to poverty, unemployment, and a sense of hopelessness.
The book argues that these economic anxieties are often exploited by politicians who offer simplistic solutions and scapegoat immigrants, minorities, or liberal elites.
It's a cycle of blame and resentment that's hard to break. The book also suggests that there are solutions, right?
Yeah.
That there are things we can do to address these economic disparities and create a more just and equitable society.
Yes, the book offers a number of policy recommendations, including investing in rural infrastructure, supporting small businesses, and expanding access to education and healthcare.
It also talks about the need to revitalize rural communities by attracting new industries, promoting tourism, and creating a more welcoming environment for young people and families.
And it's not just about government intervention. The book emphasizes the importance of community-driven initiatives and the role of local leaders in fostering economic development.
It's about empowering rural communities to take control of their own destinies and create a more sustainable future.
The book concludes with a call to action urging readers to engage in the difficult conversations that are necessary to bridge the divide between urban and rural America.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the future of our country and ensuring that all Americans have the opportunity to thrive.
It challenges us to move beyond stereotypes and generalizations and to see each other as individuals with shared hopes and dreams.
Yeah, it's a call for empathy, understanding, and a commitment to finding common ground.
And ultimately, that's what this book is all about. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and working together to create a more just and equitable society for all.
Well said. I think that's a great note to end on. White Rural Rage is a challenging book,
Yeah.
but it's also an incredibly important one. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our country and to think critically about the forces that are shaping our political landscape.
I couldn't agree more. It's a book that everyone should read, regardless of their political beliefs.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into White Rural Rage. We hope you found it as insightful and thought-provoking as we did.
And we encourage you to continue exploring these issues and engaging in the conversations that are essential for building a stronger and more united America.
Thanks for joining us. Subscribe for more bookish adventures and hit that like button if you enjoyed the ride. Don't forget to share the knowledge, spread the word.